Welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and my guest today is investigative journalist for the Sunday Times of London, Brian Deer. Brian Deer, thank you so much for being here today. I greatly appreciate it.
Pleasure, Brian. Always good to oblige the media of the United States.
And I have an extensive bio on you, and I'm going to read it because I think it's important to get that information out there. And then I have several questions for you about your most recent book. Brian Deer is best known for his investigative journalism into the drug industry, medicine, and social issues. He has twice been named the UK's Specialist Reporter of the Year, has received the annual Healthwatch Award, was the 2009 Susan B Meister Lecturer in Child Health Policy at the University of Michigan, the 2012 Distinguished Lecturer in Life Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, was made Doctor of Letters honoris causa by York St. John University in 2016, has written 3 articles for the BMJ, and produced a documentary for British PBS Channel 4. His 2020 book, The Doctor Who Fooled the World, Science, Deception, and the War on Vaccines, was an Amazon bestseller and received the Gold Award in the 2021 Independent Book Publishers Awards and the 2021 Eric Hoffer Award for Nonfiction. You have had quite the career, I must say. And you've written 3 articles for the BMJ, and they were all based on your investigation into Andrew Wakefield. Is that correct?
Well, actually, I did. I've done about 6 or 7, but the 3 I think you're referring to are a series which we called Secrets of the MMR Scare, which reported, or rather investigated, for a medical readership, the coverage I'd been giving in the Sunday Times into controversies over the 3-in-1 measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, which have been going on for the last 25 years, I guess. So those are the 3 I think you're thinking of, and they received a tremendous amount of traction in the United States. And in fact, when they were published, there was an opinion survey done by the Harris Polling Organization that found that almost half of the entire American population were aware of the main finding of that paper, which was that the research behind that vaccine scare was fraudulent.
Well, let's talk about that specifically. I want to talk about your book, The Doctor Who Fooled the World. Let's set it up, because you've just kind of set it up, but the paper was 1998, or the case series was 1998. So tell me just the bare bones about that research that he did, but also let's be clear that it wasn't borne out, and I lost count, I think, in 2018, that there were 17 follow-up studies. There's no link. So I just want to get that right out there, because we're discussing his research, but I just want to get it right out there that it's not accurate. So tell me about the case series, would you please?
Well, my investigation really focused on a paper, a 5-page paper, or study, case series, a research report, call it what you will, in the Lancet Medical Journal. It was published in February 1998. And it was this which really was the trigger for the emergence of the, if you like, modern anti-vaccine movement. Extraordinarily, it was a very simple study. It was a case series, which means it wasn't a piece of biomedical research as such, but it was reporting on a series of cases, in fact, of children who were seen at a London hospital in 1996 to 1997. And they had come to the hospital, and their parents overwhelmingly told an alarmingly similar story. They said that, well, they were reported to have told doctors that they'd taken their child to be vaccinated with the MMR, and within just a matter of a few days was showing the first signs of autism, loss of language, particular behaviors that you see in autistic children. And it appeared that these children had developed these issues within, as I say, a few days of receiving the vaccine. And the parents had come and reported their concerns, somewhat surprisingly, to a children's bowel clinic. So there were a series of parents turning up at a children's bowel clinic in London, and they would say to the effect of, my child was developing perfectly normally, received the MMR vaccine, and within a matter of a few days was showing the first signs of autism. And this paper reported on the first 12, of whom the families of 8 of the children made this very specific allegation. And they came in over a period of several months, 11 boys, 1 girl, all of them were white. One was from California, one was from the island of Jersey in the English Channel off the French coast, and the others were British. And it was this that received enormous publicity at the time. And I would say that the publicity was at the time deserved, because on the face of it, these doctors appeared to be reporting on something that was perhaps the first snapshot of what was potentially a hidden epidemic of catastrophic injuries to children caused by vaccines. And that's what it appeared to be, and that's what started it all off.
What prompted your investigation? Because years later, you became involved in this and the series that you wrote for the Sunday Times of London. How did you get involved?
Well, the short story is it was simply a routine assignment. At the time, this was in late 2003, incredibly, when you think how long ago that was. And I have to say, I haven't been working on this the whole time. I think that would be too sad a life as a journalist. But nevertheless, over this whole period of time, I've been involved in this matter. But what got me involved in late 2003 was simply the fact that at the time, in the United Kingdom, there was this massive public health scare over the safety of this vaccine, because this vaccine is given routinely to pretty much all children. About 92% of children were receiving this vaccine at the time. And the idea that this may be in some way linked to the development of autism was obviously something that would cause considerable concern, and it did. And vaccination levels had fallen dramatically over the years that followed this paper from 1998 to 2003, where I got involved. And so I was just simply asked to look at it. But I didn't look at it entirely with fresh eyes, because I'd previously been involved in earlier investigations into vaccines. I'd done an investigation into what was planned to be the world's first AIDS vaccine, which was a hopeless failure and was really a scam run out of the CDC in Atlanta, Georgia. A group of doctors who'd worked there managed to get themselves substantial government grants to set up a study that they built a company on and then floated it on the NASDAQ and then retired on the proceeds. So I'd investigated that one, and I'd also investigated another children's vaccine, the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine. And I'd spent a year investigating that. So I didn't come to the MMR issue entirely cold, but I was, if you like, forearmed as to what I would encounter when I set about asking questions about MMR.
You just used a great word there. You came into it forearmed because you had done extensive medical investigations before. So you're familiar with papers and research and reading and statistics and p-values and everything you need to know, because you're an investigative journalist. You had to learn that even if you didn't know it.
I'm not sure I've ever really got p-values, to be honest with you. I mean, okay. They're a bit slippery. But,
yeah, and they've got and even
some of the higher statistical stuff get a bit slippery on me, but I don't really need to know p-values for this story.
But my point is, you'd already done so much investigative journalism. When you went and read the paper through for the first time, did anything pop out at you and even make you baffled how it had gotten so far? And kind of what I mean by that is I'm a layperson. And so as a layperson, I depend on the trickle down of these scientific journals and medical journals. I don't, read them to investigate for myself, but I anticipate that they're accurate and they're true and my doctor knows what's going on. And so long before your investigation and before a paper is published, there's a lot of series of steps in there. There are multiple authors, systems of checks and balances, peer review, the journal editor, there's teaching hospitals involved in the research, there's an ethics committee before it gets to publication. So with all that in mind, and you read the paper, did you have any question marks about how it got so far?
Yeah, I did. When I first looked at it, I looked down at it and flicked through it, and I thought, yeah, right. And I thought that because there was a peculiar feature. I said that these parents, 8 out of the 12, well, put it the other way around, because 2 of the children were brothers. So I have to say So in fact, there were 11 families, 12 children. So the families of 8 of the 12 children, 2 out of 3, said effectively it was the MMR doctor and it came on within days. More specifically than that, they said that it came on within 14 days, with an average of 6.3 days. So it's a little bit of maths going on here. Average, the mean was the first signs of autism came on at 6.3 days. So, 6 days and the following morning. But with the range of between immediately and 14 days. 14 days. And the thing about that 14 days, it was exactly the same time link that had been chosen for a paper published in the early 1970s over the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis shot. It was a paper that came out of a hospital 3.5 miles south of where this Lancet paper we're talking about came from. And it was a paper produced under the guidance of a pediatric neurologist who got his juniors to go into the vaults of the hospital and to pull out cases where children had developed brain illnesses within 14 days of a DTP, a diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis shot. And I noticed straight away that the paper that was published in the Lancet, first authored by Dr. Andrew Wakefield, had this same time frame. And I looked at it and I thought, well, how could that be? Because even on my very superficial examination of the MMR issue at that time, I was aware that this was a live virus vaccine. I mean, viruses are never technically live, but nevertheless, they're called live virus vaccines because you're actually infecting the recipient of the vaccine with an altered strain of the viruses that you're trying to protect against, in this case, measles, mumps, and rubella. So these were live virus vaccines, but the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis shot, the suspect component in that was the pertussis component. And this was a big formalin-killed bacterium that was renowned for producing in some children immediate fevers, sometimes febrile seizures, almost overwhelmingly benign febrile seizures. And that was known for that. Whereas with the MMR shot, you would not get those kind of immediate reactions because the viruses take time to multiply in the tissue of the child who's received it. And I thought, well, why would that be? And the immediate thought in my mind was that it had been the paper, the Wakefield Lancet paper, had been prepared as in fact, I had discovered the DTP paper back in the 1970s had been prepared at the behest of lawyers hoping to start a lawsuit. And I just thought, yeah, right. And my very next thing I did after reappraising myself of the content of that paper was to phone somebody, a mother who I knew had a child enrolled in the research by this man, Andrew Wakefield, at this London hospital, and went to see her and interviewed her. And the story she told me could not be reconciled with any of the children as described in the paper. So I knew that there was something that wasn't right about this paper.
The subtitle of your book is Science, Deception, and the War on Vaccines, and we've just touched on deception. I want to take a step back to the science part of it because you wrote extensively some things that were apparent that I either want to confirm or maybe you can correct me, and that's about the science and the way that you describe it in the book. And what I mean by that is when you come up with a hypothesis and you test it, and there are methods that you do, so you're not fooling yourself. But it seems from reading your book, there might have been some backward science here, and maybe you can confirm or tell me what you found out about this. But apparently Andrew Wakefield, he kind of started with a conclusion, and then went in search of evidence. And he did use a very small sample size and starts with a press release before the paper is published, and there's a failure to replicate. So here we are. And what I mean, that's not generally how these research papers are done. Is that correct? You don't start with a conclusion and then go in search of evidence? Or how can you summarize that part of it for me?
Well, he started with more than a conclusion. He started with an instruction.
Okay, so we're back to this. We're back to deception, sort of. So let's go there then.
Well, he started with an instruction. What people didn't know was the first thing that I revealed, because the revelations about this fraud took years to accomplish and was very much like peeling an onion. And the first layer of the onion was when I revealed in the Sunday Times in February 2004 that he'd appeared to all the world to be an academic researcher, an independent researcher. He'd done earlier work in inflammatory bowel disease, but he appeared to all the world to be doing independent research that he'd brought forward in the public interest because he was concerned. He called it a moral issue. He was concerned about protecting children. What I was able to establish was that 2 years before the paper was published, he'd been hired by a lawyer named Richard Barr, in fact. He was a provincial high street solicitor, Main Street solicitor, small town on the English East Coast, wasn't in any way an expert in vaccines or medical investigations or anything like that. But he'd got a contract to see if he couldn't raise a class action lawsuit against the manufacturers of vaccines. And he hired this man, Andrew Wakefield, at very lavish rates. I can't even work out what they would be today, but back in those days, it was £150 an hour. So he was on hourly rates to make a case against the MMR vaccine. In the end, in modern American dollars, he brought up to date and done with the necessary conversions. He ultimately walked away, or was authorized to be paid, I think we probably say about 800,000 US dollars, probably approaching $1 million US dollars in today's money, to make a case against the vaccine. So that was his starting point. It wasn't only he started with his conclusion, he started with a direct instruction to do whatever he could to reach that conclusion. And the solicitor even said to him, this lawyer even said to him, if your tests are positive, we can get more money. So he set out to create evidence that would justify the funding of an enormous class action lawsuit, which would be immensely lucrative, both for him, for the lawyer, and for all the other lawyers and doctors that they would bring into this thing as they tried to make a case against the vaccine. So that was where it began. And then the second aspect of it, which we discovered at that time, was that these parents who turned up with their children weren't just the routine caseload from the hospital, children's bowel clinic, constipation, sometimes a bit of inflammatory bowel disease, occasionally that kind of stuff. They'd actually come to the hospital because they'd been sent there by an anti-vaccine group. And the organizer of this anti-vaccine group was sending members and contacts of her group to this hospital, as was the lawyer, recommending people to take their children to the hospital so that when they came to the hospital and made the allegation that their child was developing perfectly normally, received the MMR vaccine, and within days was showing the first signs of autism, well, they would say that because that was why they'd been told to come to make that allegation. And at the time, the critical issue, one of the critical issues is that to get that very tight time link between the shot and the claimed symptoms, they had to essentially, in many, if not all of the cases, massage their stories to make it conform to a very tight time link in order to get in fact, it was ultimately the British taxpayer to fund this lawsuit, because in Britain we have a scheme called the Legal Aid Scheme, and it uses public money to support people who are in litigation but can't afford to sue. So in order to get the money from this agency, they had to say that the problem came on within days, and so they turned up, and that's what they said. So this thing was, I mean, at face value, it appeared perfectly credible case series. Case series are a perfectly respectable thing to do. The first case series on what came to be known as AIDS was reported on 5 gay men in Los Angeles. Yeah, what was first identified and characterized as autism was first reported on 11 patients in the Baltimore area, 11 children in the Baltimore area. So there's nothing surprising about the fact that that there were only 12 children in this series. A lot of people, particularly doctors in the medical establishment, who have been rather, their noses are rather out of joint because they never detected this. They never exposed this paper. They never showed that there was anything wrong with it. Was simply that they said, oh, well, there were only 12 children. Well, there were only 12 children, only 12 children. Well, if you were reporting the first snapshot of a new disease, which is what Wakefield was claiming, there would only be a small number of patients. I mean, you wouldn't sit around and wait till you've got 2,000 patients came through the hospital before you started to investigate if there was some kind of possible connection between the vaccine and something like autism. So at face value, it was a credible paper. But behind it, there was this charade, which is that it was paid for by lawyers, and the patients taking part have been brought by parents who were clients of that lawyer and were members of an anti-vaccine group. So that was the first thing that we revealed in early 2004.
And let's be clear, you found documentation to support that timeline, and you have that documentation, if anybody wants to know, tracing Attorney Barr, I believe, and Andrew Wakefield, making that connection. So he was given an instruction, and then the conclusion in manufacturing evidence. My question for you, maybe you can't answer this, but it comes to me that science doesn't happen in a vacuum. So even if they're making this claim, it doesn't rest on that one claim. You have to expect other teams to come in and look at what they did and try and replicate, even if they use their data or they start doing their own testing. How did that escape the class action lawyer and Andrew Wakefield's knowledge that somebody's going to come in and try and replicate this and they're going to be found out? Even if it wasn't through the paper trail, there's no science to back it up.
Well, they just dismissed it. I mean, what Wakefield would do, he'd always come up with a new story. So people would do virological tests to see whether there's any connection, any persistence of anything from the MMR in the children's bloodstream and in the children's bodies, in the children's guts. Because his claim was, in order to bring this lawsuit, this planned lawsuit at the time, it did become a very large lawsuit and consumed in the end about $100 million at today's money. They had to show that there was some kind of mechanism, and the mechanism he came up with was that it was the measles virus live in MMR, which persisted in the children's guts, which then caused the gut to become leaky for foodstuffs to pass through the gut wall into the bloodstream, go to the brain, and cause autism. That was his idea. So all over the world, well, not all over the world, at least in 4 different centers around the world, other people set about trying to see whether there was this phenomenon had any validity. And they all found that it didn't. So he would come up with a story. He'd say, oh, well, you were looking in the wrong place. You were using the wrong forceps. The technology you were using wasn't sensitive enough. And whatever, the dog ate my homework. Whatever, he would come up with a whole series of explanations to dismiss what they say. And the great thing about vaccine scares is because they touch so many people, they are great stories for journalists because they they promote fear, and traditionally media sells best on fear. So the fact that he was saying one thing and other people were saying something else was just kind of added to the debate. So he says this, they say that. And so it went on. And what they also were able to do, with help from some sections of media, was to demonize anybody who wasn't saying the same thing as them. So people who were making their reports that they couldn't replicate these findings were just, they're working for the drug industry. This man Wakefield says, I'm working for the drug industry. And I constantly get emails and I see things online about me saying, oh yes, he's a farmer shill and all this, and that plays, it works. When these kind of smears are spread around, they work. So even though all kinds of other people were doing biomedical research which failed to confirm what Wakefield was saying, he would just shrug it off and on it would go. And then from the same hospital, he would produce a string of other papers, also falsified in various ways, in order to keep the show on the road in the way that he did.
With that in mind and your investigative work, what was the failure on the part of the journals? You've said that doctors got their nose out of joint because they didn't figure it out. What happened with the medical journal establishment? Because there's peer review. There's an editor to go through that material. And from my understanding, it was rejected by peer review. So what happened there?
No, it wasn't rejected. It was actually passed by one of the peer reviewers. It was odd because it was paired with another paper, a scientific paper, and the scientific paper and this particular clinical paper, this case series, were peer reviewed together by two different people. And the scientist who looked at it rejected the scientific paper, but the clinical paper was approved, and it was approved by somebody who was a personal friend and if you like, I suppose a pupil. Well, he was a pupil at some point, a protege, I suppose would be a reasonable word, of one of the other authors of the paper. There were 12 other authors. Although Wakefield alone wrote the paper, 11 others were granted authorship, even though, apart from maybe one or two of them, didn't fulfill the criteria for authorship at all. But they were given authorship because it added credibility to the paper. So they'd say, well, there are 13 authors, so surely there couldn't be fraud if there were 13 authors. But the other 12 didn't know what the hell was going on. But one of those 12 was the mentor of the peer reviewer. And then there were issues at the Lancet to do with the Lancet's market position, because it was losing market share to the market leader in biomedical, in general medical journals, which is the New England Journal of Medicine. And they had a particular desk editor who was of a particular persuasion. He believed that anything that was controversial ought to be run, pretty much. So it got an easy ride through the whole process. And then they'd also, at the hospital, this man Wakefield had launched a media story months before publication, which claimed that he got these findings coming. So there was enormous media interest, and it was just impossible to stop.
Speaking of the media, you're also saying the media is sort of complicit because they like a good story, fear sells. And he got I would say, a fawning press at some points. He appeared here in the United States to not as much criticism as you think you might get from the press. So how is it going over there? They have this press release, they release the paper, and what's the general feeling in the press, I guess I should say?
Oh, well, people took it at face value, because at face value, what it was saying was concerning. If it was true that there was one hospital in London, where in the space of a few months, a whole bunch of parents turned up at a bowel clinic and said, I gave my child the MMR, and within a few days, he, and in one case, she developed showing the first signs of autism. Well, that's that face value. That's something that needs looking into. So, because it may well be that other doctors at other hospitals around the world weren't as smart, weren't as vigilant. So it was taken at face value. And people, see, before I got involved in this, there was a lot, there was a whole school of thought. And in fact, there was a book published a long time ago by a doctor who said, oh, this is a media hoax. And if you look on Wikipedia, you'll see talk about somebody saying this was all one of the three great media hoaxes. Well, the thing is, neither this doctor nor anybody else, to my knowledge, has ever, and I've been following this since 2003, has ever identified a single journalist who one could reasonably say was lying. No one's ever said. So it wasn't so much a hoax by the media, it was the media being hoaxed by this man Wakefield and this lawyer and these people around them who put out this story and pumped out this story based on no evidence. They were just determined they were going to get a lawsuit going over a vaccine, and they did.
Let's talk about you write in the book about the deception and the fraud, and we've touched upon it with the class action lawsuit and the instructions. But can you give me some more details about that, such as, and you said 13 authors, and they gradually fell away. But talk to me about some of the actual deception and fraud where, no abnormal findings were found in some of the kids, yet those were changed to be abnormal.
Let me cover that. Okay. So as I say, the first layer was to discover that he was working with lawyers, and parents have been referred to him. And I then went and interviewed this mother, and I asked her, when did your child's problems come on? And she said, oh, within a few months. You remember the time scale set in the paper was 14 days. So I said, well, when you say a few months, how many? And she said, oh, maybe, 5. And so she sort of said, maybe 5 months. In actual fact, it later transpired, I discovered from court papers, that she agreed that there were no symptoms and no signs of anything that could be connected with autism or bowel disease or anything like that, at least for 9 months, right? So there was no temporal link. Yet she turned up at the hospital, and the hospital records, which I've seen, where she was telling doctors that her child started headbanging 14 days after the MMR. So we've got that. So if we were to take that temporal link, so her story was false. Then so that was a falsely reported story, but you could say that was either misremembering by the mother or fraud by the mother. Either she knew, or was she confused? Did she know? Did she refresh her memory later? So there's that one. But then other parents, for example, the only American family, there was a boy enrolled, brought to London for tests at this hospital, like as if there weren't any hospitals in where he'd come from, Northern California. No hospitals in San Francisco, so you have to come to London. Yeah, right. And he, when I got hold of him, I showed him the paper. I said, well, your child is child 11 in this series. And he said, oh, I was told my child was 13, was the 13th one I saw. So I said, well, trust me on that one. Just read it. And I didn't tell him what to think about it. I didn't give him any steer as to what he should think. And he looked at it, and it showed his child as showing the first signs of autism, the first behavioral symptoms, as this man Wakefield was calling them, within a week of the vaccine. And this guy just looked, he said, that's not true, that's not right. And he later said that if child 11 was his son, which he was, then the paper was, in the father's view, an outright fabrication. I got another mother in part of England who, she came to me after I started running stories. She came to me supplying massive documents. She kept copies of correspondence, minutes of conversations with this man Wakefield, a diary of her child's experience in the hospital, letters she'd written to his lawyers telling them that his paper was untrue in respect of her child. So what they'd done, or what had been done, was the temporal link had been altered. The time link between when these children showed the first behavioural symptoms and the onset of and the administration of MMR had been altered after they came to the hospital. Then the virology testing that had been done, the outcome from that was withheld. There was virology, sophisticated molecular testing was done at the hospital of these children looking for measles virus, all came back negative, withheld. Wakefield claimed that this problem had developed as a result of the measles getting into the gut, as I was saying, and the gut becoming inflamed and becoming leaky. And he claimed that these children had a colitis, which is inflammation of the large bowel. They had non-specific colitis. And when we eventually got the data on that, we could establish that they didn't have any kind of inflammatory bowel disease at all. And so every aspect of this paper had been manipulated in some way in terms of the writing up of the data. There wasn't a single child who had been reported accurately in that paper. They'd all been chiseled for the purpose of creating the sense of a prima facie case that there was a potential link between the MMR vaccine and autism, because they wanted to get government money to get this lawsuit up and running. And they succeeded in doing that. Then there was all kinds of pieces of information that were withheld. There is a standard panel of blood tests which can be given to patients to establish whether or not it's whether it's likely, whether there's reasonable grounds to conduct invasive tests, to actually go into children's bowels looking for inflammatory bowel disease. Those blood tests came back normal. The actual clinical finding, the principal clinical finding in these children, which was also withheld from the paper, the word was simply never used in the paper, even though this word was in the records as a profound issue in almost all of these children. These children had constipation, and that was never reported in the paper. That was their principal clinical symptom, was constipation, and it was withheld. So this paper was a concoction. It was manufactured, and nobody spotted it. And that, to me, in many ways, is the lasting issue. And as I say in my book, if Wakefield could do what he did, and in the book I show what he did, the question for me is, who else is doing what in the hospitals and laboratories that we look to for our lives, you know? So it's not really at its heart just a story about vaccines. It's a story about medical research and whether you can believe what comes out in medical journals and what comes out of hospitals. And everybody, the whole world is glued to their media at the moment about this result from here and that result from there, and to what extent you can trust those issues. And my case would be you can't trust them, because the only reason Wakefield was caught at all was because he picked on a children's vaccine that was of such public concern that I would get, for my first story, I got 4 months of time from my editors to pursue that. Now, 4 months is, I don't know how many journalists today would get the opportunity to spend 4 months on a story. Ultimately, I've been following it now for 16 years, I think it is. But Wakefield would never have got caught. See, the way I was able critically to get the data was when I first published the story. I then did a television program, and Wakefield made the mistake of suing me. Sued me, sued the Sunday Times, sued my website, sued the television station. And in the course of that, I got to see medical records. And although I couldn't use them, because actually on the day that I was sat reading these medical records in my lawyer's offices, Wakefield abandoned his lawsuit, or the records were taken away from me, and I never saw them again. And because they were sealed within litigation, it would have been I think it would have been a contempt of court. Yeah, it would have been what is it? Yeah, it would have been a contempt of court to have used the material for any other purpose. But as a result of my first stories in the Sunday Times, the UK's General Medical Council, which is the medical board for the entire United Kingdom, said they were going to have an inquiry, and I supplied them with a letter setting out in summary my findings. And they then spent 217 days between 2007 and 2010. So it went on longer than the trial of O.J. Simpson, a huge hearing in which all of the medical records of these children were read aloud over and over and over in my presence in a committee room at the medical board's headquarters in London. And there I was able to bring out the true story of what happened to these individual children, what their histories were, what their diagnoses were, and so on and so forth, which enabled me to do that. You wouldn't be able to do any of this in some other area. If you were to, like, I don't know, heart disease or diabetes or something, or cervical cancer or any other area of medicine, no journalist would be able to get that amount of investigative power to crack open even a case series of 12 patients. And to the best of my knowledge, and I say this often, and I've still not had anyone contact me to contradict me, to the best of my knowledge, I'm the only journalist who's ever gone round the back of a piece of biomedical research, identified the patients, found out what was wrong with them, found out what their blood tests were, what their status was across all the parameters of their examinations within a hospital and by their family doctors and what have you. Nobody else has done it. And my point would be, if anybody else got the chance to take a look at research over all sorts of things, even COVID-19, you would find an absolute rat's nest of chiseling and alterations and funny goings on. And Wakefield got caught, as I say, because he picked on a vaccine.
What you've said is truly horrifying in a way, because if we go right back to the beginning, these parents of the children, they are desperate for answers. Something's wrong with their child. For some of them, it's been years. They need answers. They don't know what to blame. You have to find something out. It can't just be the way it goes. They get linked to Wakefield, sent to his center to study, and they finally think that they're going to get heard and get a voice and get some answers. And basically the only thing that's accurate in the reports you're saying are the numbers that they were seeing, the random numbers of 1 through 12. And they were just used to manufacture evidence so that for profit. What you're saying there is just horrifying to me. And I have one of the best sentences I've read in a long time came from your book. And I want to sum up this part of the conversation by reading it because it was great, relating to the attorney there. And so it would be that the otherwise unmemorable solicitor emerged from the undergrowth of his chosen profession to sue over MMR. Over 12 years, he and Wakefield nurtured a crisis over the vaccine. That kind of tells it all right there. And just using those parents, that's just astounding to me. So it's all about profit. It's all about Wakefield and Barr and the class action lawsuit. They never had any medical concern at all, as far as you can tell?
Well, it's difficult to go into somebody else's mind, isn't it, as to what they thought? But certainly they never produced any evidence at that time, and no compelling evidence has come forward in the intervening years that would give anyone any credible grounds to believe that the MMR vaccine was causing autism in any substantial numbers of children at all. And to produce 12 children and in 2 out of 3, actually at the end of the day, all 12 made the allegation that the MMR vaccine was caused their child's problems. In fact, at the hospital, 11 of the families of 11 of the children made the direct allegation that the MMR vaccine was responsible, but Wakefield only reported on 8 of them. And when I go out, I do a reasonable amount of speaking when the aircraft are flying. And please, let's hope they're flying again soon. I often say, well, I say to people, I've just been given in the middle of a lecture. I'll be saying, well, I've been telling you this whole thing was rigged in order to support a lawsuit and so on and so forth. But there's a contradiction in here. If that was the case, why were there only the families of 8 children making the allegation? Why didn't they all make the allegation? And people say, well, you know, and I say, well, the answer to my question is they did. In the end, all 12 did, 11 at the hospital, and then 1 afterwards. She wrote to Wakefield saying, well, I've been visited at home by a lawyer, and so now I've looked at my family photographs, and I can see that, yes, it must have been the MMR, because I've got a photograph of my son looking normal, and I've now got a photograph of him after he was vaccinated, and he looked abnormal. And so, yes, it was the MMR. So, and she put in a legal claim as well. So apart from the American, who couldn't claim in the English system, but who did make the connection at the hospital, everybody, all of them blamed MMR. But as you say, they're very vulnerable people, and they were, you know, if you kind of think about yourself in their position, they have got, well, most of them did actually have children that had significant developmental issues, some quite profound developmental issues, such that they would never have an independent life. They could never lead an independent life, come what may. They were severely challenged. People like that, they'd do anything to their children. If a doctor at a credible hospital said, well, it might not work, but if we're having good results with amputating left legs or whatever, they'd say, well, you know, if you've got to do it, you've got to do it. And in fact, nobody's left leg was taken off. But what in fact did happen was that these children were, and I have to say, this is my opinion based on 16 years of work, and I'm not a doctor, can't go beyond that, but I've looked at these children's records and I know what happened, and I've listened to the parents and I've got their correspondence and I've got their records. In my view, these children were assaulted at that hospital. They were assaulted because they've been brought there for no good reason other than to advance Wakefield's campaign to make a case against the MMR vaccine. There was this big pretense that they'd been brought there for clinical reasons. They all had bowel disease, and they all had to, you know, not one of these children lived in London. The nearest was 60 miles away. A couple of them were 280 miles away. One was on an island off the French coast. One was in Northern California. These children hadn't come to that hospital for medical care. Those children had come to that hospital because this man, Andrew Wakefield, thought he was going to find, and he claimed that he did, although there's no evidence with the testing that was done at that hospital using very sophisticated molecular methods, that he was going to find measles virus in their small intestines. Now, to get to the small intestine, you have to you use a colonoscope, and so you go in through the rectum, you go up through the sigmoid colon, up the descending colon, then you do a turn at the hepatic flexure, then you cross the body just below the breastbone behind. This is the transverse colon. Then you do another turn, you go down the ascending colon, then you come to a little valve, and then you have to like maneuver this tube through that little valve to get it into the small intestine. This is not a trivial procedure on small children at all. It's a pretty trivial procedure on adults. I've had one, in fact, I've had 3. It's a pretty trivial procedure on adults. It's not on children. In fact, one of the children, not one of the 12, but one who came through later, was severely injured, so severely injured that there was a lawsuit and a massive financial payout because this children's gut was pretty much torn apart in the process of all this.
I have to ask you a question right there, because this research was conducted at a hospital. And so research conducted under those auspices, there's an ethics review board that has to approve unless I'm completely mistaken here, that has to approve the layout of the study. What are you going to do? What happened there? What failed?
Oh, they were lied to. They were lied to. And it was claimed, actually, the paper itself, the research ultimately said that the tests were approved by the investigations were approved by the hospital's ethics committee, and it hadn't. And in fact, a High Court judge said that this was false. No, they'd been lied to. So not only was there that intubation, then you had children kicking and screaming. These are kids who don't like their routines altered. I mean, autistic kids are notorious for being very fussy about their routine. They might come out of their front door and always have to turn right or touch a lamppost, or they don't like going to strange places they've not been to before. They don't like the rhythm of their lives being altered. One of the children, he used to, if anything interrupted his watching of the particular programs, he would watch particular television programs with puppets over and over again. And if there's any interruption, he would cross the room. This was in the days of, in the days of cathode ray televisions, he would pick up the television set and smash it, right? That's the kind of kids that were being enrolled into this study. I have to say in passing that child's, as he grew up, that issue became much less of him displaying these kind of very violent behaviors, really with the advent of flat screen televisions that could be screwed to the wall with a perspex glass across the front of it, so he couldn't smash it. That was his solution even today. These were very seriously affected children for the most part. So they were kicking and screaming. They needed 3 people to hold them down. They were having tubes forced up their nose because the Wakefield wanted to get into the small intestine, and these children were constipated, and therefore it was very difficult to clear their bowels. So they were using nasogastric tubes, which are pretty horrible things to put in. They were required to undergo chest x-rays, EEGs, brain scans, a whole battery. It took they arrived on a Sunday and left on a Friday. And over that time, one of the children was collapsed 4 times in a corridor. 2 of the children had to be seen by other doctors. One was admitted as an emergency case to another hospital because of the effects of lumbar punctures, because they were being given lumbar punctures, needles in the spine. And all of this was being done in order to get into their small intestines and to build up a case upon which the funding could be obtained to bring forward a $100 million class action lawsuit.
And after all that testing, when they didn't find what they wanted to find, they just made it up and said it was there.
Wakefield changed the results. Well, you wouldn't find it, because if you recruited patients in this way through an anti-vaccine group and a lawyer, and the vaccine didn't cause autism in these children, and it's extremely unlikely that it did, although we could go into that whole question about the relationship between autism and vaccines if you want, but it's because the actual consensus in medicine is not quite the way it's presented by the certain people in the medical establishment, the people who you will always see on television. But the point being is that all of this was being done to get this lawsuit up and running. These children were just a ragbag group of constipated kids with developmental issues. So you would get completely random, useless results. And so Wakefield then went through and changed the results to make it all look more plausible.
I got to ask about something you just said there in passing, the consensus among the medical community and autism. I don't know if you want to, what are you talking about there?
Well, I mean, one of the things that gives a lot of energy to the anti-vaccine movement is people, and there's really only 1 or maybe 2 doctors who appear on American television talking about this issue, and they're both vaccine developers. And there's this kind of, oh, vaccines don't cause autism. And, I mean, I've often asked, and I've often asked from time to time, asked on websites, well, what do you mean by that? When you say vaccines don't cause autism, what do you mean by that? And usually the conversation doesn't proceed. People are not willing to engage in it because.
Well, can I engage for one? Can I just offer one thing there? So may I? So when you're saying the vaccines don't cause autism, you're starting with a null hypothesis. The vaccine does not cause autism. And a scientist really can never say that with 100% certainty, right? You can never you can never accept the null hypothesis. So is that where you're going, or what are you saying?
Well, that's the first thing. That's the first thing. It's logically impossible to prove the negative.
But you can get pretty close.
But you can get pretty close. Now, at the population level, so if you're talking about big numbers, big epidemiology, looking at thousands, tens of thousands of children, you will find no connection between vaccines and autism. And that kind of work has been done again and again and again now over the years. That it's pointless doing it anymore because the figures, and once they get the HMOs in, where they can start retrieving data on hundreds of thousands of patients, because the HMOs obviously have massive computer databases and they control for correlations and things. You're not going to find any connection. But could there be a particular person, particular child maybe, who received a particular vaccine on a particular day when they had perhaps had some other medical condition or whatever, you cannot exclude that possibility. And I've talked to pediatric neurologists. I can think of three who, and these are people who specialize in brain issues in children. I say to them, I remember saying to one, I said, well, I can actually see a potential mechanism whereby there might be, in some cases, a connection. And he said to me, well, I agree with you, but you'd never get me saying that. So there could be, but how many there are? I mean, when I began this thing, I mean, I came up with a kind of an example, which I think is as good today as it was when I came up with it, is I say to people, well, have you ever seen a white squirrel? And most people will say no. Some people will say, yeah, I've seen a white squirrel. And I'd say, well, you've seen a white squirrel.
I've seen a white chipmunk.
Well, then that doesn't quite count. You're being a bit cheeky there.
Okay.
White squirrel, right? We're squirrels. And I'd say no. And I'd say, well, are you willing to believe that there are white squirrels? And they'd say, well, yeah, because everybody understands, well, most people understand the albino principle, whereby, you might think they would have pink eyes as well, like rats. I don't know. But anyway, and then if I say to them, well, have you ever seen a fluorescent green squirrel? And they'd say, well, no. And I'd say, are you willing to believe that some squirrels are fluorescent green? And they'd say, no, I'm not. And my point would be that if there are any cases of autism if there are any people out there who have autism, who wouldn't have autism if they hadn't been vaccinated with a particular vaccine on a particular day, if there are such people out there, then it's somewhere between white squirrels and fluorescent green squirrels. It's exceptionally rare, but that doesn't mean it has to be completely discounted. But in the sort of cut and thrust of debate, the vaccine developers kind of just airbrush that out. They just go, oh no, vaccines can't cause autism. And the thing that galvanizes the anti-vaccine movement is that they're aware that there have been sporadic cases where alternative causes can't be rejected. And so it is a more complicated thing. And prior to the COVID pandemic, I probably wouldn't have said that at all. But today, I think everybody understands that vaccine safety, like pharmaceutical safety generally, is a risk-benefit calculation. Every medicine that works hurts somebody. It's just a fact. Any medicine that has no side effects in anybody doesn't work and is not a medicine. You know, homeopathy is like that. No side effects because it doesn't work. So now I think people are aware that it's a risk-benefit calculation. But what we know is at the population level, there is no connection. And we also know that vaccines undergo a huge amount of testing before release and post-marketing monitoring to find out what happens. And so if there is any connection between vaccines and autism, it is a very, very rare thing. And your chances of coming upon it I mean, I've never come across a case. I mean, I've been looking, well, added to the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis thing, I've been looking for a quarter of a century for a vaccine injured child. And I've looked at court cases, I've looked at the best. I mean, even in this $100 million lawsuit in the UK, they couldn't produce a case. It went on to be another lawsuit in the United States in 2007, where the lawyers who were trying to make the case that the vaccine caused autism, the MMR vaccine caused autism, they had 6,500, 7,000 cases. They couldn't find one. They put up their best test case, clearly showed signs of autism before the child was vaccinated. They can't find them. People cannot find these cases. So, you know, so it's a very complex picture, but at the end of the day, the vaccine is safe. But that isn't the same thing as saying, you know, vaccines don't cause autism, because that's an unsustainable proposition.
Well, I'm glad you sum it up that way, because, yeah, you can't prove a negative, and perhaps if the universe is in alignment with a certain person on a certain day, something 1 in a billion can happen. But from a public health perspective, when you're looking at a population level, it's a risk-benefit equation. And I think
it goes beyond that. I mean, it actually goes beyond that in the sense that it's now fairly clear that the MMR vaccine is protective against autism, in the sense that you're more likely to get autism if you're not vaccinated than if you are. So it goes that way as well, but it still doesn't eliminate the potential, which anti-vaccine campaigners are very aware of, the potential that there could be some cases out there. So when one particular parent comes along and says, you know, my child was vaccine damaged, it would be hundreds of thousands to one that they're wrong, but they might be right, you know?
Right, and I understand what you're saying, that you can't prove a negative, so even a scientist will be 99.99% sure. Anybody can say, oh yeah, well, what about that final hundredth of a percent? And so, but at a population level, you can't hang your hat on that. I want to sum up with just 2 things, because I know we're running here and you're very busy. So there are 2 things I want to ask you. And I guess I'll start with Wakefield. You do confront him. I shouldn't say confront him. You do approach him at one point to hold him accountable. And by accountable, I mean in the scientific community, accountable means you have to explain yourself. So he's made this claim, you track him down, and you ask him some questions so you can get some answers. But unlike if you're at a scientific presentation, he doesn't take the opportunity to talk to you and maybe clear some things up or tell you where you went wrong. He literally walks briskly away from you. So that is not a scientific reaction that he could sit down and say, hey, you know what, I've read some of your stuff, here's where I think you're wrong, let me explain it to you. He just bolts. Did you find that, I guess it's a dumb question, but did you find that surprising? I mean, have you ever spoken to him?
Well, he was in the room when I was deposed by his lawyers for 6.5 hours because he'd sued me first in the United Kingdom, and then he sued me again with the British Medical Journal in Texas. And in that, we actually went to deposition. So he deposed me for 6.5 hours with a video camera running. And they were really, really hoping to get a reaction out of me, because I'm quite a reactive person. I mean, I wouldn't say my hands are clamped to the arms of my chair, so like I don't wave my arms around, but I am a very reactive person. And they thought they were going to get some reaction out of me, because in depositions, you're being video recorded. And at one point, his lawyer was shouting across the table at me to try and get me to react. And I just sat there absolutely calm. And they never produced the transcript of that, never produced the video. So I met him then. I met him, as you say, when I had a film crew with me, and he essentially put his hand over the lens and ran off like a used car salesman who had a case to answer. And but I've written to him on a number of occasions, and he's just never going to put himself in a position where he's interviewed by anybody who's got a developed understanding of what he did, because what he did was to manufacture the whole story pretty much from start to finish, fundamentally in that paper, but also in several others which are falsified, in order to make money. He had a whole raft of business schemes. He patented his own vaccine 9 months before he called for the MMR vaccine to be suspended in favor of single vaccine, single measles, single mumps, single rubella, and he patented his own single measles vaccine 9 months before. And it's just one thing after another. It was just the whole thing was just really. I mean, I would characterize it as being corruption. But as I say, I think there's a lot more of it in medicine than anyone would ever imagine. And as I say, the only reason he got caught was because he picked on something where a journalist could actually get sufficient support from the newspaper and from the medical journals, from television station, to spend the time necessary to get himself up to the speed to understand the ins and outs of the medicine involved.
You're leading actually right into the last question I had, because you've mentioned it a few times now about scientific research and how there's a lot of backwards things happening perhaps that get published and the public just doesn't know, and this was something that you could investigate. But I want to talk about Richard Horton and the Lancet finally, because the paper was published in the Lancet and Richard Horton was the editor. And prior to publication, he was an advocate for scientific and academic integrity, and I think he founded a review board for that. Since publication, he's written extensively on what he calls the case against science. And I just want to read one thing here that this is from Richard Horton. The case against science is straightforward. Much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analyses, and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn towards darkness. He wrote that in 2015 in The Lancet. And he also said that scientists too often sculpt their data to fit their preferred theory of the world, or they retrofit hypotheses to fit their data. Journal editors deserve their fair share of criticism too. We aid and abet the worst behaviors. It's kind of an interesting quote coming from him, or I should say it's kind of interesting that he fell into the middle of this based on his prior academic integrity positions and his post-academic integrity position. What do you think happened here?
Well, I mean, he got very badly embarrassed by the fact. I mean, when I first went to him and put to him some of these issues, he attempted to destroy the story and to undermine what we were doing, and he failed. He was opposed to the medical board investigation of Wakefield. He did everything he could to stop it, but ultimately it was carried forward. The results came in, and he's rather changed his tune. But you see, he says these things. A lot of medical journal editors say these kind of things. They usually put it in books near the end of their career. But they don't do anything about it. The medical journals, if they all got together and said we need some form of decent regulation of biomedical research, where, in my view, there should be spot checks on laboratories, just like there are on restaurants. I tried writing a piece for Nature once, and in fact, they commissioned me to write a piece, and I said, well, how is it that restaurants get assessed for their safety and laboratories don't? And the Nature editor said, oh, we can't publish that. We're the house magazine of science. You can't suggest that scientists aren't more ethical than restaurant managers. I think there should be that. I think there should be inspectorates able to go into labs and check things. I think there's a lot that could be done if the medical journals wanted to create a fuss about it, but they don't. So every so often an editor will say these things to virtue signal about how concerned they are and this problem, but they won't do anything about it because it would be very, very expensive and time consuming to investigate complaints about academic papers. I mean, there's a lot more that come in these days, but mostly they're to do with like image manipulation, things that you can see at face value. You look at the page and you see that maybe somebody has taken a photograph of something that they've used in another paper and used it again, or they've turned it upside down, or they've changed the assay result in some way that you can tell by reading the paper. But the kind of stuff I'm talking about, you couldn't tell just from reading the paper at face value. You have to get behind it. And that's not something they would want to do because it's so expensive, and then the authors will sue you, and so on and so on and so forth. So Horton is now making the right noises, but is he doing anything about it? Not really, no.
Brian Deer, I thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I greatly enjoyed this conversation. It's gone in a lot of different areas. Your book, The Doctor Who Fooled the World, Science, Deception, and the War on Vaccines, it's a great read, and I especially like that it's from several different angles, from a summarization of Wakefield's angle, I guess I should say, because of course you're not first person, all the way up to when you got involved, and I appreciate the work that you do and you being here today. You also have a fictional book out, Blind Test?
Blind Trial.
Blind Trial, my mistake. Yep. Blind Trial, and just give me a synopsis of the plot there, because I think it's relevant.
That's a story of a woman doctor who goes to a biotechnology conference and wants to complain because she's involved in a huge clinical trial of a new vaccine, and she's concerned about ethical irregularities that have taken place in this clinical trial, and she takes it up with an extremely hot young man who's a lawyer, working for the same company that she's working for, and ultimately we set off in search of what it's all about. And all I can say is there's a fair bit of sex in it, because it's a pharmaceutical thriller. So yeah.
Are there pictures? I'm just kidding.
No pictures. But,
I'm just kidding. I was just kidding.
Plenty of vivid imagination.
All right, and
It is actually a good book. I think in many ways it's a better book. But yeah. Anyway,
I did
you
see
find them on Amazon. Just look on Amazon.
It's on Amazon. I did say it was available on Kindle, so it is in publication now.
You'll get it on Kindle. Yeah, Kindle. Yeah.
Great. All right, Brian Deer, thank you so much. I am Brian Kirby. This has been 502 Conversations. My guest, investigative journalist Brian Deer. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Nice talking to you.
Thank you.